I feel like we use the word bipolar for, well, literally anything that fluctuates these days.
Oh, constantly.
Right,
Yeah.
like, the stock market is bipolar today, or a friend changes their mind about dinner plans and we just casually say they're acting bipolar.
Right. It has become this massive cultural cliche.
It really has.
And, in the process of becoming a cliche, that word has been completely divorced from its actual clinical reality.
Which is exactly why we are taking this deep dive today.
Exactly.
We have an incredible stack of sources for you listening today. We're looking at the foundational history of psychiatry, the strict diagnostic criteria that doctors actually use today, and these massive longitudinal studies that track patients week by week over decades.
Really fascinating data.
Yeah, it's wild. So the mission for you listening today is to just strip away all of those pop culture cliches. We're going to explore the actual mechanics of these highs and lows, how this illness, physically cycles in the brain, and why truly understanding this condition could literally save lives.
To start stripping away those cliches, I think we have to recognize that bipolar disorder is fundamentally a condition where the brain's mood and energy regulating systems, well, they lose their equilibrium.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
So in a typical brain, a severe mood state eventually settles back into a baseline.
Right, like you get sad, but eventually you level out.
Exactly. But in this condition, the brain gets trapped in profound, self-perpetuating cycles. It can't settle.
And before we can even begin to understand how those cycles work, we have to completely redefine what we think of as the poles. Because, man, almost everything pop culture has taught us about this is just dead wrong.
Oh, 100%.
So walk us through the actual clinical reality.
Well, the first major misconception to shatter is the timeline. Bipolar disorder is not intraday moodiness.
Right.
It is not shifting from happy to angry to sad and then back to happy between breakfast and lunch.
Right, which is what I think most people assume it is.
Yeah, they do. But that kind of rapid hour-to-hour emotional shifting aligns much more with conditions like borderline personality disorder or, frankly, just normal human emotional reactivity.
So we are talking about highly sustained states.
Yes. By clinical definition, these episodes last for days or weeks at a time. And the poles themselves, the mania and the depression, are not simply symmetrical opposites of normal emotion.
So it's not just sad versus happy?
No, not at all. Depression in this context isn't just being, very sad. And mania is absolutely not being very happy.
That's a crucial distinction, I think. So what does a full manic episode actually look like, in the diagnostic criteria?
So the DSM-5, which is the current diagnostic manual from 2013, requires a period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood.
Irritable is key there.
Huge. And it's accompanied by a massive increase in goal-directed activity or energy. Practically, this looks like a severely decreased need for sleep.
Like insomnia.
Not exactly. Insomnia is wanting to sleep, but you can't. This is feeling completely rested after only 2 or 3 hours of sleep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it involves racing thoughts, pressured speech where they literally can't get words out fast enough, and reckless behavior that is severe enough to cause genuine functional impairment in their life.
And that level of severity is how the current medical structure categorizes the disorder, right? Because it's not just one single illness.
Right. It's actually split into 3 main categories. First, there's bipolar 1.
Okay.
This requires at least one full manic episode lasting a minimum of 7 days, or an episode requiring hospitalization.
So the mania is the main feature.
Yes, the patient will likely experience severe depressive episodes too, but that full, intense mania is the defining feature.
Then there's bipolar 2. And I want to pause here for a second because I hear people refer to bipolar 2 all the time as bipolar elite. It's the diet, less serious version of the illness.
Oh, which is a wildly dangerous misconception.
Yeah, it really is.
Bipolar 2 is defined by a history of at least one major depressive episode and at least one episode of hypomania.
Hypomania meaning?
Meaning it has the same symptom set as full mania, so high energy, decreased sleep, racing thoughts. But it is milder. It doesn't trigger psychosis or require hospitalization.
But the depression side of bipolar 2 is where the danger really lies, right?
Heavily, yeah.
Yeah.
Bipolar 2 is a condition overwhelmingly dominated by chronic, notoriously treatment-resistant depression.
Wow.
Because of the sheer severity and duration of those depressive episodes, bipolar 2 actually carries an equally high, and in some studies higher, suicide risk compared to bipolar 1.
So it is absolutely not a mild condition.
Not at all. And just for context, the third category is cyclothymic disorder,
Right.
which involves chronic but milder fluctuations between hypomanic and depressive symptoms lasting for at least 2 years.
Got it. Now, I want to circle back to the mania side for a second, because there is this really common desire in our culture to romanticize mania.
Oh, definitely.
We view it as this euphoric, highly productive, almost magical state of being. But, reading through the clinical realities and the sources, full mania frequently curdles into intense irritability, terrifying paranoia, and outright psychosis.
Yes.
The best way I could conceptualize it when I was reading is this. If normal joy is like driving a car fast on an open highway, mania isn't just driving faster.
Right.
Mania is the gas pedal getting permanently stuck to the floor while the steering wheel completely detaches from the dashboard.
That is a clinically precise way to visualize it.
Right, because it might feel exhilarating for a brief second, but it very quickly turns terrifying, destructive, and just entirely out of control.
Exactly. It is a state of lost control, not a state of enhanced joy. And understanding that dynamic really helps explain a counterintuitive fact about how people actually experience this disorder over time.
And this brings us to the timeline reality. This completely shifted my perspective when we were going through the research.
It challenges everything the public assumes, honestly. In 2002, a researcher named Louis Judd and his colleagues published a landmark study funded by the NIMH.
The National Institute of Mental Health.
Right. And they did something completely unprecedented. They tracked the symptom status of bipolar patients every single week for an average of over 12 years.
A 12-year longitudinal study, checking in weekly, that is massive.
It is. And the findings totally upended the field. Judd found that bipolar I patients spent roughly 3 times more weeks depressed than they did manic or hypomanic.
3 times more depressed.
Yes. And for bipolar II patients, the ratio was even more extreme. Just heavily skewed toward profound depression.
Wait, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. If they're depressed 3 times as often as they are manic, and sometimes far more than that, then the whole idea that people with bipolar disorder are constantly swinging back and forth like a metronome is just entirely false.
Entirely false.
Yeah.
Another key finding from that study is that euthymia, which is the clinical term for a stable, balanced mood state, is actually the most common state when patients are receiving effective treatment.
So they aren't always in an episode.
Right. Even without treatment, there are usually periods of baseline stability between the extreme episodes.
But that heavily skewed timeline creates a massive bottleneck in the medical system, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you spend most of your symptomatic time crushed by depression, and your brief periods of early hypomania actually feel kind of productive and good, you are only ever going to go to a doctor when you are suffering.
You only seek help for the depression. You sit in a psychiatrist's office. You report feeling hopeless, lethargic, and suicidal.
Great.
You do not mention that 2 years ago you had a 4-day period where you slept 2 hours a night and reorganized your entire garage because, to you that was just a really good week.
Which leads to an incredibly grim statistic in the data, an average 10-year diagnostic delay.
10 years.
For a decade, patients with bipolar disorder are routinely misdiagnosed as having unipolar depression.
A decade of suffering, trial and error, and worsening symptoms.
And this is where the mechanics of the brain become really vital for you listening to understand. Let's look at what actually happens in that psychiatrist's office. If a patient is misdiagnosed with standard unipolar depression, they're usually prescribed a standard antidepressant, like an SSRI.
Right.
What actually happens to a bipolar brain when you introduce that medication?
It can be catastrophic.
Really?
Yeah. When you treat unipolar depression, the clinical logic is to boost the available neurotransmitters, like serotonin, to lift the mood out of a deficit.
Okay.
But a bipolar brain doesn't just have a deficit. It has a fundamental underlying structural instability in how it regulates energy.
Ah.
If you pump an unstable mood system full of activating neurotransmitters without also providing a mood stabilizer to set a ceiling on that energy, you aren't just lifting them to a normal baseline.
You're blowing right past the baseline.
You are catapulting them. The clinical term is antidepressant-induced switching.
Wow.
The medication actively launches the patient out of depression and directly into a manic or hypomanic episode.
That's terrifying.
Or even worse, it induces what's called rapid cycling, which is a severe state where the brain begins ricochet between 4 or more distinct mood episodes in a single year.
So by giving an unanchored antidepressant, you are essentially pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly.
Which naturally raises a huge historical question for me. If giving the wrong pill is literally a matter of life and death, and the line between unipolar and bipolar depression is that critical, how did earlier doctors even figure out these were two distinct illnesses?
Right.
Especially back before we had genetic testing or brain scans or any of that.
Well, to understand that, we have to travel back to 1899. A German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin was working in the asylum system, observing patients over very long periods of time.
Okay.
Back then, the medical field operated under the unitary psychosis theory.
Meaning they just threw all severe mental illness into one giant diagnostic bucket.
Exactly. They believed it was all just one underlying disease expressing itself in different ways.
Right.
Kraepelin overturned that. He started noticing a pattern in the longitudinal outcomes of his patients. He saw a group of patients with severe episodic mood illnesses who, despite suffering immensely during their episodes, generally returned to their baseline cognitive function between them.
So they weren't deteriorating intellectually over time.
Right. So he grouped all episodic mood illnesses into a new category he called manic depressive insanity.
Manic depressive. Okay.
And he cleanly separated this from what he called dementia precox, which we now know is schizophrenia, because those patients did experience progressive cognitive decline.
So Kraepelin draws the first major line in the sand. Mood disorders over here, progressive psychotic disorders over there.
Exactly. But Kraepelin's manic depressive umbrella was still way too broad.
How so?
He was lumping together people who only ever experienced depression with people who cycled between depression and mania.
Ah, I see.
It wasn't until 1957 that another German psychiatrist, Karl Leonhard, formally proposed splitting them into unipolar and bipolar courses.
And how did they prove Leonhard was right?
Family studies. In 1966, researchers Jules Angst and Carlo Paris looked at the relatives of patients. They found that relatives of bipolar patients had significantly higher rates of bipolar disorder specifically.
Oh, wow.
Meanwhile, the relatives of patients with unipolar depression only showed elevated risks for unipolar depression. The illnesses were running in families independently of one another.
So that hard data finally pushes the American Psychiatric Association to formally split the two in the 1980 release of the DSM-3.
Yes. And then 14 years later in 1994, with the DSM-5, the APA makes a major linguistic shift.
This is a big one.
They officially remove the term manic depression and replace it with bipolar disorder.
Why do they do that?
The primary goal here was destigmatization. Over the decades, the word manic had been weaponized in pop culture. It was used as a slur.
People heard manic depressive and pictured a horror movie villain, not a human being with a treatable medical condition. Bipolar, meaning two poles, sounded neutral, clinical, and scientific.
And I understand the intention behind that. I really do. But I have to push back on this heavily, based on the writings of Kay Redfield Jamison in our sources.
Oh, she's brilliant.
She is a brilliant clinical psychologist who actually lives with bipolar I. Her argument is that by changing the name to bipolar, psychiatry accidentally severed the most important clinical reality of the illness.
The depression.
Yes, the depression. Think about it. If you tell the general public someone is bipolar, they picture a perfectly symmetrical pendulum swinging evenly between two poles.
Right.
They don't picture an illness that is overwhelmingly characterized by crushing chronic depression. By making it sound like this exotic two-pole condition, did the psychiatric field ironically cause the massive misdiagnosis problem we see today? You know, you were hitting on one of the most difficult tensions in modern medicine. When you optimize a diagnostic term for public relations and anti-stigma, you run the risk of obscuring the clinical reality.
Right.
The intention in 1994 was noble protecting patients from a stigmatized label. But you're absolutely right that the public perception of bipolar as a symmetrical swing is entirely false, and that false perception delays treatment.
So we've gone from unitary psychosis to manic depression to bipolar disorder. The definitions shift as our understanding of the brain shifts. But what is actually happening in the hardware of the brain to drive these cyclical episodes?
The foundational piece of the puzzle is genetics. Bipolar disorder is one of the most highly heritable conditions in all of psychiatry.
Really?
Yes. Twin studies, which are the gold standard for this kind of research, show that if one identical twin has bipolar disorder, the other has a 60 to 85% chance of developing it as well.
That is staggeringly high.
It's comparable to schizophrenia and vastly higher than standard unipolar depression. But it's vital to note, there is no single bipolar gene.
Right?
The condition is highly polygenic. This means there are thousands of tiny genetic variations that stack up to create a fragile mood architecture in the brain.
Okay.
That genetic vulnerability sits there, waiting to interact with environmental triggers, things like severe sleep disruption, substance use, or massive life stress.
So the genetics build a fragile system and the environment pulls the trigger.
Exactly.
But what I found most fascinating in the research is what happens after that first trigger. It's a concept called the kindling hypothesis.
Oh, this is crucial. Proposed by NIH researcher Robert Post in 1992. Post actually borrowed this concept from epilepsy research.
Epilepsy.
Yeah. In epilepsy, if a mild electrical stimulus in the brain is repeated over time, it eventually triggers a full seizure with less and less provocation.
Ah.
Over years, the neural pathways become so sensitized that seizures begin happening completely on their own, without any external stimulus at all. Post argued that the exact same biological mechanism happens in bipolar disorder.
Meaning every single untreated mood episode physically sensitizes the brain.
Every untreated episode reinforces the neural pathways of the illness. It makes the next episode more likely to happen. The episodes become more frequent, they become more severe, and they get triggered by smaller and smaller stressors.
Wow.
Eventually, the brain's mood system becomes so unstable that episodes arise completely autonomously.
So think of it like a trail through a dense forest. The very first time a mood episode happens, the brain resists it. It's hard to push through the brush.
Right.
But every subsequent untreated episode tramples those weeds down a bit more, snapping branches, creating a clearer path. Eventually, that path becomes a paved road, and the brain can just slide down into mania or depression effortlessly.
That's a perfect analogy.
This is why a wait-and-see approach after a first manic episode is so incredibly dangerous. You have to block that path early with treatment, or the brain literally learns how to cycle faster.
That is exactly why early, sustained intervention is paramount. You have to stop the kindling process. But what is truly wild about the history of this condition is that the discovery of the very first effective medication to stop that kindling was a complete, literal accident.
Oh, the story of John Cade in 1949. For those of you listening, this is unbelievable.
Cade was an Australian psychiatrist working in a converted kitchen at a hospital in Melbourne.
A kitchen?
Yes. And he had developed a completely mistaken theory that mania was caused by a toxic compound circulating in patients' urine, specifically uric acid, the same compound associated with gout.
So he decides he wants to inject guinea pigs with urate salts to see if it makes them manic. But urate salts are notoriously hard to dissolve into a liquid.
Right, so Cade chooses a specific compound, lithium, solely because lithium urate was the most soluble form he could find.
Okay.
The lithium was meant to be nothing more than a chemical delivery vehicle, a beaker, essentially. But when he injected the guinea pigs, they didn't become manic, they became incredibly placid. Lethargic, but fully conscious. Cade quickly realized it wasn't the urate calming them down, it was the lithium.
And lithium is just a naturally occurring salt, like an element on the periodic table.
Exactly. So Cade boldly tested lithium on severely manic patients at the hospital, and the calming effects were dramatic, undeniable, and immediate.
Wow.
It was a miracle treatment. And while Cade didn't know the exact mechanism in 1949, modern science shows that lithium acts as a profound neuroprotectant. It alters how sodium is transported across brain cells, physically stabilizing the rapid firing of neurons.
But, and this detail had me practically yelling at my notes, despite discovering this miracle, brain-protecting treatment in 1949, lithium was not approved by the FDA in the United States until 1970, a 21-year gap.
It is a total tragedy of timing, fear, and economics.
Let's look at the economics. Because lithium is a naturally occurring element, no pharmaceutical company could patent it. And without a patent, there is no exclusive profit. Without profit, no company was willing to fund the incredibly expensive clinical trials required for FDA approval. Combine that with the fact that in the late 1940s, a different compound, lithium chloride, was being marketed as a salt substitute for heart patients in the U.S., and it actually caused several toxicities and deaths.
Regulators were understandably terrified of the word lithium.
Yeah.
But the end result was that corporate economics and regulatory fear stalled a life-saving treatment for 2 decades, while countless patients suffered through unmitigated kindling.
It is a stark reminder that medical progress is, well, it's messy. And frankly, even today, with highly effective treatments available, the actual process of defining where this illness begins and ends remains a clinical battlefield.
Oh, the diagnostic boundaries are constantly shifting. A perfect example is the pediatric overdiagnosis epidemic that swept the United States in the 1990s and 2000s.
Right. Suddenly, rates of pediatric bipolar diagnosis were just skyrocketing out of nowhere.
Because a subset of researchers and clinicians started labeling chronic severe irritability in children as a developmental presentation of bipolar disorder.
Okay.
But critics pushed back fiercely. They argued that conflating ordinary, albeit severe, childhood irritability with the distinct episodic mood illness was going to lead to over-medicating young children with heavy antipsychotics and mood stabilizers they didn't actually need,
So how did the psychiatric community resolve that?
by inventing a new diagnostic box. In 2013, the DSM-5 created a neighboring condition called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or DMDD.
DMDD.
Yeah, its explicit stated purpose was to catch these chronically irritable kids and get them behavioral help without giving them a lifelong bipolar label and the heavy medications that come with it.
And that debate over boundaries isn't just about kids, is it? There is an ongoing massive debate in the field about the bipolar spectrum.
Oh yes, championed by researchers like Hagapa Kiskal. The argument here is that bipolarity isn't just a strict set of clinical categories, but a dimensional spectrum.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
That it runs all the way from classic severe bipolar first down through bipolar 2 and continues into soft temperamental variants like people who just naturally have cyclical moods as part of their baseline personality.
But, that raises a massive red flag for me. If you make the spectrum that broad, aren't you just medicalizing normal human temperament?
That's the exact worry.
Right, because if someone is just naturally highly energetic, intense, and occasionally moody, do they really need a psychiatric label and a mood stabilizer?
That is the exact counterargument that keeps the DSM-5 anchored to strict categories. The medical field is terrified of over-medicalizing the human experience, but spectrum advocates argue we are leaving millions of subthreshold patients suffering without help.
Which brings us to perhaps the most famous and culturally entrenched blurry line of all the mad genius trope. The persistent idea that this illness is inextricably linked to profound creativity.
It is a narrative deeply woven into our culture,
Yeah.
and, well, there is empirical data behind it. Studies by prominent psychiatrists like Kay Redfield Jamison and Nancy Andreessen have shown significantly elevated rates of mood disorders among prominent writers, poets, and artists.
We see it all the time.
We have well-documented modern cases of brilliant creatives with formal bipolar I diagnoses. People like the late Carrie Fisher or the broadcaster Stephen Fry. And historically, figures like Virginia Woolf, whose diaries painstakingly document these intense cycles of profound productivity, followed by total, debilitating collapse.
But reading through the clinical distinctions in the sources, we have to draw a very hard line here, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Because the research shows that it is hypermania, that milder sub-threshold elevation, that may sometimes correlate with verbal fluency, quick associative thinking, and boundless energy. But full-blown mania and severe depression, they're almost always profoundly impairing.
Exactly. You cannot write a cohesive novel when your thoughts are racing so fast they fragment into psychosis, or when you are physically incapacitated by a depressive episode.
And this is where we need a philosophical pushback on how society talks about this.
Definitely.
We love the myth of the tortured artist. It makes for incredible cinema. But the data clearly shows that full episodes destroy productivity rather than create it. When pop culture glorifies the genius of bipolar disorder, we are actively minimizing the severe disability, the agonizing pain, and the incredible daily effort these individuals are fighting through just to survive.
Glorifying the illness completely erases the suffering of the patient. It replaces their lived reality with a romanticized caricature.
Well said. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull all these threads together for you, the listener. What are the absolute critical takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, first, bipolar disorder is shockingly common, affecting roughly 1 to 3% of the global population across its spectrum.
Second, it is defined by episodes that last days or weeks, not rapid intraday mood swings.
Third, and perhaps most critical for changing public perception, depression dominates the lived experience. It is that skewed ratio that leads to the tragic 10-year diagnostic delay.
And fourth, because of the kindling effect in the brain, leaving it untreated allows the cycles to accelerate and worsen. Early intervention, accurate diagnosis, and public literacy, especially about recognizing past hypomanic behavior when someone presents with severe depression, are absolutely vital.
Because catching it early fundamentally alters the trajectory of a person's life.
It really does. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you listening with a final thought to mull over. We've talked deeply about the neural mechanics, the medical history, the accidental treatments, but there's a broader, almost philosophical implication here about how we live.
If we look at the active policy debates around workplace accommodations, it raises an unavoidable question about modern society.
Right.
The primary goal of treatment is to achieve euthymia, a stable, balanced mood. And we know this condition is highly heritable, deeply woven into the genetic fabric of the human population over millennia.
Meaning this isn't some rare anomaly, it's a persistent evolutionary part of the human condition.
Exactly. Yet we have built a modern industrialized world that demands a flat, perfectly consistent 9 to 5 output from every single person, every single day, 365 days a year.
Yeah.
So for the 1 to 3% of people whose brains are fundamentally genetically wired to cycle through distinct seasons of intense, hyper-focused energy followed by profound periods of rest, we have to ask how much of their daily impairment is the biological illness itself, and how much is simply a rigid society that completely refuses to accommodate anything but a straight line.
Wow. That is an incredible question to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning what you think you know, keep learning, and most importantly, share this context with the people in your life, because the more we understand the true mechanics of these highs and lows, the faster we can dismantle the stigma. Until next time.